The Second World War put the worst of human potential on full display. All of planet Earth suddenly found itself engulfed in the fight between good versus evil and nation versus nation. Amidst the chaos and devastation, stories emerged that defy comprehension. Disturbing secrets, obscure mysteries, and astonishing events that will both chill and captivate those that are willing to listen. Today, we're going to be covering the World War II Iceberg, a collection of stories and military operations through the most tumultuous conflict in human history. If you haven't seen an iceberg video before, all you really need to know is that all of the entries listed towards the top of our chart are more well known to the general public. However, as we dive deeper into the bottom layers, the topics that we discuss will become more disturbing and obscure. Now, this is an iceberg chart that I've created myself, and any layers that we don't get to today are still a work in progress and may change in the coming parts. If while watching this video you'd like to participate in the discussion with others, be sure to go down to the comments and share your thoughts. I'll be down there as well. Now, without wasting any more time, let's begin our dive into the World War II Iceberg. The Battle of Los Angeles. February 25th, 1942, 2:25 a.m. Los Angeles, California. The military has just detected an unknown aircraft approaching the coast of California. A blackout is issued across Los Angeles County, requiring all citizens to shut off their lights to make it difficult for enemy attackers to establish visual contact from the air. At the time, tensions had already been high on the Pacific coast of the United States. With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor having occurred less than 3 months prior, there was a constant looming fear of another attack on the American homeland. Now that the country was officially enveloped in global war, all bets were off, and in that moment, it seemed that the United States was about to receive another bad hand. A short while later, the darkness of the blackout was shattered as searchlights erupted to life, pointed towards the sky, wildly sweeping through the night, scouring for the unidentified aircraft, before they all seemingly converged onto something. Just after 3 o'clock, the citizens' worst fears seemed to have been confirmed. The military was given permission to open fire upon the aircraft, firing .50 caliber machine guns and pumping anti-aircraft shells at their target, still positioned high in the air. Within hours, the sun would rise over the city of Los Angeles, yet the people would still be left in the dark. It was very unclear what had just occurred. To paint a better picture of what happened on that February morning, we need to rewind a little bit. As we've already briefly touched on, this was all occurring shortly into the United States' involvement in World War II, and at the time, the fate of the world was truly unclear. The attack on Pearl Harbor was unprecedented for the United States up until this point. We had never been attacked like this before, and given the advances in aviation and military power since the First World War, there really wasn't any telling how bad things were about to get, especially for those on the West Coast. In fact, it was already confirmed by this point that the Japanese had begun to set their sights on the Golden State. Literally days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, on the 20th of December 1941, a U.S. tanker ship named the SS Agri-World was positioned just 20 miles off the coast of California when it was attacked by a Japanese submarine which fired 14 artillery shells, all of which missed. Luckily, the ship was able to return back to the coast before the submarine could continue to fire. This wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, 2 days prior, on the 18th of December, a Japanese submarine shot and damaged the SS Emidio, resulting in the death of 5 crew members. Then, on the 23rd, the SS Montebello was attacked and sunk. These attacks, which would continue over the coming weeks and months, made citizens abundantly aware that the Japanese were right on their doorstep and were capable of attacking not only Hawaii, but also the mainland United States. This tense pressure would remain until early on the morning of February 25th. It would come to a head. At 1:44 a.m., 3 separate radar stations picked up an unknown aircraft approaching the city of Los Angeles from the Pacific Ocean. 15 minutes later, it was detected at being just 125 miles off the coast, and with this, several anti-aircraft batteries were armed and aimed towards the sky, prepared to defend the city. By 2:25 a.m., as we've previously discussed, air raid sirens sounded throughout the city, and magnificent searchlights shone to life, aimed towards the sky, trying to detect this object, before the military began firing.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area shortly after 3 a.m. Pacific War Time this morning. The anti-aircraft guns began barking during a blackout ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach. Army officials declined to comment on the possibility that the object might have been a blimp. However, it required nearly 30 minutes to travel some 25 miles, far slower than an airplane.
It was unclear exactly what had been detected by the military, though it had apparently been moving much slower than an airplane would. According to this CBS News report, traveling at just 50 miles per hour. Sightings from witnesses on the ground varied, with reports ranging from mentions of a single aircraft to a blimp to a balloon. Henry L. Stimson, then Secretary of War of the United States, even stated that there had been evidence of, quote, as many as 15 planes that may have been involved. Several years after the war had ended, in 1948, college professor and former Air Force Major William A. Goss, in accordance with the United States Air Force and the University of Chicago, dug deeper into exactly what happened that night. With new access to classified information on the incident, Goss wrote the following. A careful study of the evidence suggests that meteorological balloons, known to have been released over Los Angeles, may well have caused the initial alarm. This theory is supported by the fact that anti-aircraft artillery units were officially criticized for having wasted ammunition on targets which moved too slowly to have been airplanes. After the firing started, careful observation was difficult because of drifting smoke from shell bursts. The acting commander of the anti-aircraft artillery brigade in the area testified that he had first been convinced that he had seen 15 planes in the air, but had quickly decided that he was seeing smoke. Competent correspondents like Ernie Pyle and Bill Henry witnessed the shooting and wrote that they were never able to make out an airplane. He goes on to discuss the fact that even if there really had been enemy aircraft over the city, it's hard to see what the purpose would have been, as no bombings or attacks of any kind occurred that night. Even still, if we take a look at some of the other photographs snapped of the sky over Los Angeles, we can see that the searchlights do appear to be fixated on something, with this strange collection of bright dots being captured on film from multiple angles. There are plenty of unanswered questions here. Even if William Goss is correct in his conclusion that a weather balloon started the chaos, what drove the military to begin opening fire on it? Especially if no hostile behavior was observed. On top of that, if it really was just the balloon, then what did the radar detect approaching the coast from way out over the Pacific? From my own research on the subject, as well as what we know about the wartime anxiety caused by the ships from the months prior to the incident, here's what I personally believe happened. Something was detected over the Pacific, again by 3 completely separate radar systems. What exactly that was, I'm not quite sure. Maybe it was a private aircraft or another weather balloon of some kind. Either way, this sparked fears that a foreign attack was imminent and the military was put on high alert. As a result, confusion ensued from the blackout, searchlights, air raid sirens, and general late-night delirium. Perhaps from there, the sighting of a weather balloon served as the spark, which ignited the night sky over Los Angeles with gunfire. Although it's probable that the Japanese weren't involved at all in the Battle of Los Angeles, the same cannot be said for our second entry on this iceberg. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. This next entry involves a very grim turn that the war could have taken. I'm assuming a fair number of you have already heard of Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, also known as Operation PX, but if you haven't, buckle up. This story begins towards the end of World War II in December of 1944. By this point, the tide of the war had shifted immensely. With the fascist government in Italy having surrendered, the Allies having successfully stormed the beaches in Normandy, and the German hold over Europe slowly receding closer towards Berlin, the writing was beginning to form on the wall for Germany. For the Japanese, it was starting to become clear that it was only a matter of time before the Allies would focus all of their attention on the war in the Pacific. If and when the war was lost to the Allies in Europe, it would essentially be them versus the world. This isn't to say that the United States hadn't already been focusing heavily on Japan, however. In fact, they had already firebombed several different Japanese cities, resulting in the death of hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens. As you surely already know, the Japanese were relentless during their fighting in the war, conducting kamikaze missions where their pilots would be expected to slam their planes into enemy targets, giving up their lives for the Japanese Empire. What would such an extreme nation do upon realizing they're backed into a corner with seemingly nothing to lose? In the final days of 1944, Vice Admiral Jishiburo Ozawa proposed Operation PX, with the codename originating from the term Pestis bacillus, a disease more commonly known as the bubonic plague. The operation, also codenamed Cherry Blossoms at Night, laid out the use of Japanese Aichi M6A Syrian bombers loaded with fleas infested with the bubonic plague, which would be carried aboard submarine aircraft carriers. 5 such submarines would be used, each carrying 3 planes. Upon reaching the coast of San Diego, they would surface, launch the planes, and deploy the fleas via balloon bombs, before crashing the planes into the city. As we know from earlier, the Japanese were more than capable of sneaking across the Pacific Ocean using submarines, so this really wasn't that far of a stretch. The plan was formulated in association with Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii of Unit 731, an undercover biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. Unit 731 was engaged in horrific human experimentation programs responsible for some of the worst atrocities during World War II. And yes, that's considering everything that happened in Germany. We'll talk more about them later in the iceberg. The plan was finalized on the 26th of March, 1945, but was swiftly condemned and set aside by Chief of General Staff Yoshijiro Umezu. The following is a statement he made regarding his decision after the war had ended. If bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria. Japan will earn the derision of the world. Despite his opinions, the plan still easily could have been executed and pulled off the shelf if the Japanese had a change of heart, or were faced with the slow decay of their empire. Had the war gone in another direction, had conditions worsened, it's impossible to say what might have happened, especially since the operation had already been completely planned out and finalized. If the war had continued on for several more years, slowly pushing the Japanese closer and closer to the edge, there's a chance we could have seen the deployment of biological warfare over the United States. The operation was planned to be executed on the 22nd of September, 1945. However, just 1 month before that date, the United States would take decisive action. Japan announced their surrender on the 15th of August, 1945. Had the US waited just 1 more month to drop the bombs, it's possible that the world would look very different right now. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night would have obviously done more than just damage the United States. It could have started a global pandemic of disastrous proportions. We've seen from the last couple of years how quickly disease can spread out of control. Imagine that, but with the bubonic plague. When the Black Death hit Europe, it killed between 75 and 200 million people. Imagine if it were to be released into the wild again, this time into a globalized world where international travel is just a part of everyday life. This is the first time I have said anything about Operation PX. I don't feel comfortable talking about it even now. But at the time, Japan was losing badly, and any means to win would have been alright. Escaped Nazis. Towards the end of the war, as the situation in Germany was obviously becoming dire for high-ranking officials, it became clear to many that once the Allies took Berlin, their days would be numbered. As a result, beginning around 1944 and 1945, many of the Nazi elite began planning their escape from the country, and often from the European continent as a whole. You may have heard rumors of Nazi officials running away to Argentina and other remote areas of the world, and these are largely true. Although the exact number isn't certain, some sources say that around 10,000 or more former German military officials and war criminals made it to South America alone following the end of the war. The routes used by the Germans to escape to various parts of the world have been dubbed the rat lines and allowed for many horrible people, including those who ran extermination camps within Germany, to simply vanish into thin air. Once these Germans had escaped from Europe, they largely would go on to South America, mostly to Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. There, Argentine President Juan Perón, who apparently admired dictators like Hitler and Mussolini, supported the escapees and aided in their disappearance. Perón had spent some time working with Italy's military during the war, and there had built many relationships with German SS agents. He also viewed the Nuremberg trials as, quote, an insult to military honor. Shortly after the war had ended, Perón then enlisted the help of Antonio Caggiano, a cardinal of the Catholic Church in Argentina, to begin welcoming collaborators of the Nazi Party into the country. It was at this point into my research into the rat lines that I discovered something I didn't expect to uncover. Apparently many, if not most, of the rat lines were supported and facilitated by the Catholic Church, not just in Argentina, but from the Vatican as well. Several of the most powerful authorities with the Vatican, such as Alois Hudal, helped many of the most vile, high-ranking Nazis escape to Argentina. many of which were directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. They worked with Spain, who had supported Germany and Italy throughout the entirety of the war, to aid in the escape of thousands of Nazis. One of the primary lines would take sympathizers from Germany down south into the city of Rome, the home of the Vatican, before making a pit stop in Genoa and escaping into the Mediterranean and out to South America. Another line ran from Germany to Spain before the criminals would escape out into the Atlantic, again often headed to the Americas. From there, the escapees could have scurried to any number of countries, including Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Guatemala, Bolivia, and many others. Again, many of the Nazis who actually ended up getting away were the worst of the worst. One such criminal was Adolf Eichmann. The man you are currently looking at was one of the major organizers of the Holocaust. The damage he is responsible for is immeasurable. To give a brief overview of who Eichmann was, he simultaneously joined the Nazi Party and the SS, Hitler's agency of security, mass surveillance, and state terrorism. He quickly climbed through the ranks, eventually becoming head of the department responsible for managing the Jewish people in Germany, with a focus on pressuring them to leave the country. By 1939, with the war officially broken out and German aggression at an all-time high, Eichmann began concentrating Jewish people into ghettos located within cities as a sort of holding location, while the party figured out how to address the, quote, Jewish problem. Eichmann's department tried first to force the Jews to emigrate out to different countries, and even planned on sectioning off reservations for them in other parts of the world, namely within Poland and Madagascar. We'll dive deeper into these plans to build a sort of Jewish reservation later on in the Iceberg. On the 22nd of June, 1941, with the Axis powers in full control of essentially the entirety of Europe, they began Operation Barbarossa, invading Russia in a surprise attack. Simultaneously at this time, German policy began to shift from simply trying to emigrate the Jews out of the country to blatant extermination. Adolf Eichmann, along with many other top SS officials, met at the Wannsee Conference on the 20th of January 1942, where the, quote, final solution to the Jewish question, essentially the official codename for the Holocaust, was planned. There, it was determined that approximately 11 million Jews would be slaughtered. The plan expanded beyond just Germany and would be carried out within any nation that the Nazis could gain control over. Soon after the occupation of Hungary, Eichmann and his staff were given the responsibility of deporting Jews to extermination camps, most of which he sent to Auschwitz. 3 out of 4 people were gassed upon arrival. At the Nuremberg trials at the end of the war, Dieter Wislicini, one of Eichmann's subordinates, stated on record that he once told him that he would, quote, leap laughing into the grave because the feeling that he had 5 million people on his conscience would be for him a source of extraordinary satisfaction. Now that you know exactly who we're talking about, you'll start to understand the level of injustice that comes with seeing this type of person slip through the cracks. When the war ended, he was briefly captured by the United States government in Germany before he escaped, acquiring a fake identity and started constantly moving around to evade detection, before briefly settling down in Lüneburg Heath, an area of open country located in northern Germany. He lived there for several years before obtaining another false identity using a Red Cross passport under the name Riccardo Clement. From there, he followed a rat line which led him to Genoa, Italy, where he used his passport to enter Argentina in 1950. He remained there for many years, working a variety of jobs before eventually landing one at Mercedes-Benz, where he worked up the corporate ladder and began trying to live a normal life. For a while, it seemed that he had escaped for good. That is, until Jewish Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal began investigating his whereabouts. By the way, can we take a second to just appreciate that Nazi hunter is probably the most badass title a person can have? Anyways, in 1953, Wiesenthal was actually informed that Eichmann had been spotted in the capital city of Argentina, Buenos Aires. From there, many different private detective and spying missions were conducted before they tracked Eichmann down to his home. However, because neither Germany nor Argentina were likely to do anything to extradite Eichmann and bring him to justice, in 1960, Israel's National Intelligence Agency, the Mossad, sent agents into Argentina and abducted him in broad daylight as he stepped off a bus in front of his house. From there, they drugged him, disguised him as an Israeli airline worker who had suffered a traumatic brain injury, and flew him out of the country. From there, Eichmann was put on trial in Israel, where he faced 15 different charges, being found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death and was hanged on the 31st of May, 1962. Unfortunately, not everyone who escaped via the rat lines was brought to justice. One such person was Joseph Mengele, a physician and German SS officer. He earned the nickname Angel of Death for his actions during the war. He is mostly known for the human experimentation programs he conducted at Auschwitz, specifically his experiments on twins, pregnant women, children, and the disabled. For a moment, I want you to just think about your own life. Think about your family and your friends, any daily routines you might have, childhood memories, good or bad. Each and every single one of the 6 million Jews who were killed during the Holocaust had just as elaborate of lives as we do, and by sheer luck, they were dealt the most unfortunate hand of fate. Following the fall of Berlin, Mengele hid in Germany for many years before utilizing the rat lines with the assistance of a Catholic clergy member. He entered into Italy before escaping from Europe and heading to Argentina. There, he began working as a mechanic and laid low in the city of Buenos Aires. However, around 1960, following the capture of Adolf Eichmann, he became much more careful, moving around between several South American countries before ultimately settling in Brazil. For many years, Nazi hunters such as Simon Wiesenthal, the same man who aided in the Eichmann investigation, attempted to bring him to trial, along with West Germany and Israel. However, Argentina still seems to have remained tolerant with the Nazis, even decades after the war had ended, allowing Mengele to slip through the cracks. He never paid the price for his crimes. In 1979, he managed to wriggle his way into the ground on his own by dying of a stroke while swimming off the coast of Brazil. These are just 2 of the most notorious Germans who were able to escape following the war, but countless others were able to get away during the chaos that ensued on the continent. Many probably went on to live very secretive lives across the world. Considering how large the Nazi Party grew to be, some of us have certainly interacted with these people without even knowing it. And no, they didn't just escape to South America. They were spread all across the world, much closer to many of us than we'd like, which leads into our next entry. Operation Paperclip. War is a powerful catalyst for technological advancements. Planes, rockets, computers, armored military equipment, nuclear power and weaponry. All of the major powers who fought in World War II made significant developments in each of these fields. However, clearly, these projects are almost always top secret and are kept hidden from the enemy. That is, if the government is still around to secure them. In the final stages of the war, the Allies created T-Force, a collaboration between the US and British armies to recover scientific technology and intellectual assets from Germany, before they could be destroyed out of defiance or stolen, even though that's exactly what they were planning on doing. With the German government completely destroyed by this point, many industrial and scientific technologies were essentially up for grabs, and the Allies weren't going to waste any time in securing them. At first, these goals were simply that, essentially looting the advancements left behind in the ruins of Germany. But eventually, when it became clear that the Soviets had the exact same idea in mind, the goal of T-Force grew to also sabotage and halt Soviet efforts to do the same. The Allies even went as far as to destroy anything that they couldn't take with them. By April of 1945, the world had become overwhelmingly aware of the advancements Germany had made during the war, as well as the fact that every other country was making the same realization. A silent race to collect the scraps of the German war machine ensued. The United States, in particular, was at the helm of these efforts, eventually culminating in Operation Paperclip, a top-secret intelligence program with the sole purpose of collecting German scientists, technicians, and engineers and bringing them to the United States for government employment. Some of these personnel were more innocent than others. However, many of them were high-ranking leaders within the Nazi Party. One of these men was Wernher von Braun, a member of the Nazi SS who worked to develop rocket technology for Germany throughout the Second World War. Most notable was his development of the German V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, as well as the very first man-made object to enter into space. It was one of Germany's three, quote, vengeance weapons, designed to attack Allied cities in response to their bombings against German cities. The rocket would go on to be fired at targets in Belgium, London, and other cities in the UK, Paris, and other French cities, as well as the Netherlands. During the war, V-2 rockets were responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people throughout Europe. Even worse, their production was facilitated through the use of thousands of forced laborers, including prisoners and those living in concentration camps. According to the BBC, an estimated 12,000 prisoners died as a result of their forced participation in the production of the rockets. According to declassified FBI records, Wernher von Braun had met with Hitler on multiple different occasions, even being formally decorated by him twice. However, once the war had drawn to a close in May of 1945, von Braun and many other rocket engineers surrendered to the United States, hesitant to give themselves up to either the Soviets or the United Kingdom. Later that year, he was transferred to Fort Bliss, Texas, along with plenty of other rocket parts which had been looted, where he could continue his work. Von Braun would then start working hand-in-hand with the United States government, essentially picking up right where he left off from in Germany. Initially, he simply worked on missile and rocket technology as he had up until this point in his career. That is, until the space race started heating up. With the launch of Sputnik 1 by the Soviets, it became very clear to the American people that they were losing the space race. It was at this point that the United States government saw a new purpose for von Braun. On the 29th of July, 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA, was established. There, he was given the key role of developing a launch vehicle which would get America to space. From there, von Braun became an essential member of the space program. He became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where he worked to develop the Saturn V rocket, which by July of 1969 would take us to the moon.
3, 2, 1. 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Just 2 decades prior, von Braun had been a member of the Nazi SS, whose work directly supported the Axis takeover of Europe, the bombings of several Allied cities, and led to the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Yet, by the end of the 60s, he was an American hero, credited with the success of the Apollo missions and the advancement of United States missile technology. And all of this concerns just one of the 1,600 different scientists, technicians, and engineers who were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Arthur Rudolph was another member of the operation, a German engineer who, like von Braun, had worked on V-2 rocket production for the Nazis before emigrating to the United States to work on the space program. In the early 1980s, the United States Office of Special Investigations uncovered that Rudolph had connections to Mittelwerk, a factory the Germans had built during the war, which used slave labor from surrounding concentration camps to build rockets, namely V-2 missiles. Estimates say that approximately 20,000 people died at Mittelwerk while producing the rockets, more than were killed using the weapons themselves. He was then interrogated regarding his activities in Nazi Germany and was allowed to renounce his United States citizenship and leave the country, lest he face criminal persecution. He moved to West Germany and was never charged for his complacency during the war. Plenty of other scientists taken from Germany under the operation followed similar paths, working for the United States on space, military, and other related programs, often holding high-ranking positions within the government and developing close ties with American leadership and businessmen. Nazi super soldiers. This entry mostly revolves around something called D9, which was an experimental performance-enhancing drug developed by Germany towards the end of the war. By March of 1944, Germany's Operation Barbarossa campaign into the Soviet Union had begun to fall back into Europe. With the Nazis now on the defensive and their forces now depleting in size, they needed an edge. It was around this time that German Vice Admiral Helmuth Hay approached physicians in regards to the production of a drug that would produce superhuman strength within soldiers. Perhaps what they had lost in numbers they could make up for in deranged, unbridled strength. What they eventually came up with was a formula which, in one single pill, contained 5 milligrams of oxycodone, 5 milligrams of cocaine, and 3 milligrams of methamphetamine. According to researcher Wolf Kemper, who uncovered the project, quote, "The aim was to use D9 to redefine the limits of human endurance." The drug was tested on prisoners interred at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, who were able to march for up to 55 miles per day without rest, all while carrying 45-pound backpacks. Apparently, the doctors had become ecstatic about the results they were seeing, and they wanted to begin rolling the drug out into the army as soon as possible. However, by this point, the war was already quickly drawing to a close, and D9 never saw the light of day. However, this wasn't the only effort by the regime to improve military performance. Although their understanding at the time was limited, the Germans had experimented with artificially increasing the testosterone levels of their soldiers in order to increase aggression as well as combat performance. They also explored authorizing the use of anabolic steroids to increase both the muscle mass and physical strength of their forces. These experiments, as you might have guessed, were conducted on prisoners and others held in concentration camps. Efforts to create soldiers with superhuman abilities were made especially during the year 1945, when Germany was grabbing at straws, trying anything they could to make a comeback. The Battle of Castle Itter. Okay, this next entry is very absurd. In the final days of the war in Europe, like literally 2 days before Germany would surrender, the Americans and the Germans teamed up to fight the Germans. Let me explain. Castle Itter is situated on a hill in Austria just above the village of Itter. After the Germans annexed Austria in 1938, they leased the castle from its owner before just flat out stealing it in 1943. They then transformed the castle into a prison, which operated underneath the Dachau concentration camp, situated some 60 miles north. However, the situation at the castle was a bit strange. It was intended to hold high-profile French citizens, such as former Prime Minister Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, high-ranking military officials, political leaders, as well as famous French tennis player Jean Barotra. These people were mostly held by the Germans to use as political tools should they need them later on. But for some time, they just kinda hung out there. They weren't really mistreated to any great extent, and they had much more freedom around the castle than you might expect. They were free to visit the castle library and even to go outside, of course under the supervision of the Germans, but as long as they didn't try to escape or push any buttons, things weren't too bad for the VIPs. By the time April rolled over to May in 1945, the Third Reich was just days away from collapse. The Allies had liberated almost all of occupied Europe and had pierced all the way through Germany and into the city of Berlin. Hitler had just taken himself out in his bunker underneath the city, and by this point, the members of the German military, for the most part, just wanted to ride out what were clearly the last days of the war and get back home. At Castle Itter, still under the remnants of German control, the prisoners had actually maintained contact with the outside world through a hidden radio, which they used to monitor the progress of the war and were well aware of the fact that the government could collapse at any moment. Although at first glance you might assume that they would be ecstatic to hear this news, the narrative changes when you realize that the castle wasn't just under control of the German army, but also of the SS. That might sound a little bit confusing, so let me clarify. For simplicity's sake, the Wehrmacht was essentially just the regular German armed forces. They were just regular foot soldiers who, again, by this point, just wanted to get home in one piece. However, the Schutzstaffel, or the SS, were a completely separate organization from the Wehrmacht, often considered an elite force within Germany. Now, these were the guys who were most responsible for the Holocaust and all of the other atrocities. With this in mind, towards the end of the war, both of these groups found themselves working together in sort of strange configurations, which was the situation at Castle Itter. The SS, unlike the Wehrmacht, were not as ready to give up their hold over the castle, and the prisoners knew this. Realizing that the SS might retaliate and attempt one last act of defiance before the end of the war by murdering everybody in the prison, the stakes were clearly very high. Now, again, the lines get a bit blurry here, so stick with me. The man at the head of Castle Itter was an SS officer by the name of Sebastian Wimmer, who, by this point, unlike his other peers in the SS, was beginning to realize that it was likely only a matter of time before he would have to either face the Allies or go underground. In late April, Wimmer met with the two captive French prime ministers held in the castle, who wanted to know what would happen to them given the current conditions. The two explained that, should they be killed, Wimmer would be held responsible and would face the consequences once all was said and done. Wimmer, likely to their surprise, agreed and assured them that he would do anything in his power to protect them from the rest of the SS, and potentially even help them to escape into Allied territory. However, once April turned to May, shit really hit the fan. Eduard Witter, the SS commander of the Dachau concentration camp, pulled up to the castle. Now, as you might recall from earlier, the castle was under the authority of Dachau, giving Eduard Witter full command. When he entered the castle, he informed Wimmer that he had just ordered the execution of the remaining 2,000 prisoners. Later that night, Eduard Witter would apparently shoot himself in the heart. The following day, on the 3rd of May 1945, a Yugoslav communist resistance member named Zvonimir Kukovic was subsequently told to leave the castle, supposedly to run an errand for Wimmer. In actuality, Kukovic had been given a letter written in English explaining the situation at the castle and requested assistance from the Allies. He was told to give it to the first American he ran into. Again, this was like literally days before Germany would officially surrender, so any remaining pockets of resistance were completely surrounded by the Allies. Kukovic would go on to run nearly 40 miles that night before finally running into a heavily armored American infantry division just outside the Austrian city of Innsbruck. He handed them the note, and they immediately set a plan in motion to rescue them. However, on the way back, Kukovic and the American forces he had just acquired were stopped in their tracks by heavy shelling that was raining down in the area. This required a large portion of the Americans to turn back, with only 2 jeeps of soldiers pressing forward onto the castle. For now, we're going to put a pin on these 2 jeeps, but just remember that Kukovic had successfully acquired 2 jeeps full of American soldiers to provide reinforcements, and that they were on their way. Back at the castle, it slowly began to dawn on Wimmer that pretty much every single one of his commanders were dead, and seeing nothing to lose at this point, he ran away from his post. Shortly afterwards, the other SS guards in the castle followed suit. This left the prisoners completely alone. However, now that they had been alerted that the SS was literally just roaming around massacring all of their remaining prisoners, they decided to hunker down at the castle, arming themselves with any remaining weapons. By this point, the prisoners were unaware that Kukovic had actually succeeded in gaining the support of some Americans. So they decided to send out the Czech cook of the castle, Andreas Krabo, down to the nearby town of Virgil in search of more support. He arrived on bike with a similar note in hand and was able to reach members of the Austrian resistance. The situation in Virgil was, like seemingly everywhere else at the time, a complete mess. The town was recently abandoned by the Wehrmacht as, again, they just wanted to get home at this point. Soon after, though, SS troops came and immediately reoccupied the area. However, a small unit of the Wehrmacht had actually remained in the village, this time joining forces with the Austrians to fight against their German counterparts. The Austrians took Kukovic to Wehrmacht Major Joseph Gongol, who was leading them through the resistance in Virgil. Gongol was, on paper at least, a very devoted member to the German cause, leading them through the Normandy landings, the invasion of Russia through Operation Barbarossa, and many other prominent battles throughout the war. At some point towards the end of the war, though, Gongol seems to have experienced a change of heart, instead switching sides to the Austrian resistance. Now, it's not like Gongol had a huge number of forces by this point. Only around 20 Wehrmacht soldiers were left under his command. However, he's sure that the Americans would almost definitely be willing to help if they could get to them in time. From there, Gongol and his remaining soldiers headed north, around 8 miles to the city of Kufstein. There, he approached a group of American troops led by Captain Jack Lee with a white flag, before cautiously and slowly approaching him with the exact same English letter that Andreas, the Czech cook, had handed him earlier. The American Captain Lee looked over the letter which explained the situation. In just a few moments, he was on board. Now armed with Captain Lee's 14 US soldiers and Gongol's remaining Wehrmacht forces, the unlikely group pushed back towards the castle. The French prisoners were excited to see that reinforcements had arrived, though they were disheartened to see their small size and worried that it wouldn't be enough to protect themselves if the SS were to show up. Forced to make do, Lee ordered the men into defensive positions around the castle before placing his Sherman tank at the main entrance. Sometime later, Captain Lee had been sitting at the top of the castle keeping watch with a pair of binoculars when he spotted something horrifying. Soldiers were surrounding the area, and no, they weren't reinforcements. They were Waffen SS, who were setting up anti-aircraft guns, as well as an 88mm artillery gun nearby. After the others gathered around to see what was going on, it quickly became clear that they were being surrounded by around 100 to 150 Waffen SS soldiers. It was clear that these men were still loyal to Hitler, despite the fact that he was already dead, and that they were there to wipe out anyone still inside. Although the prisoners were told to hunker down and hide, they ended up staying outside, ready to fight along with the American and Wehrmacht soldiers. Now, just in case this hasn't hit you yet, I want you to try and imagine how this looks from the outside. Both Americans and Nazi Germans fighting alongside each other with the help of two French prime ministers trying to defend this massive, crazy-looking medieval castle. As the night went on, forces were sent from the group of SS members below them up to the castle on the hill to try and find any weak points, to see how well defended it was. The two groups began to exchange light fire. At some point while this was going on, just before the SS sent their full troops up to the castle, Captain Lee heard the phone start ringing inside. Surprisingly, it was an American major. He had just arrived at Virgil with Kukovic and plenty of other American and Austrian soldiers. Captain Lee shouted that they were getting shelled and tried to explain what was happening before the line was cut. By the morning of the 5th of May, the SS soldiers launched their full attack and began making their way up the hill. All hell broke loose, with the SS severely damaging the castle, killing several of the defenders, destroying the Sherman tank blocking the entrance, and blowing a hole into the main wall. During this chaos, the French tennis star Jean Barotra offered to hop over the wall surrounding the castle and down to meet with the reinforcements in order to guide them and prepare them for what they were about to run into. Somehow, this guy ran past like 100 elite German SS officers and didn't get shot once. He made it all the way down, immediately rounding up the relief force, fully armed with plenty of soldiers and tanks. They reached the castle by around 4 o'clock that afternoon and ended up defeating the SS officers, where they captured around 100 of them by the time they actually surrendered. This one obviously isn't anywhere near as dark as some of the other entries on this iceberg, but I just thought it was an absurd and often overlooked piece of history. The Niihau Incident. Okay, for our next entry, we're stepping back to 1941, specifically back to Hawaii and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Following the surprise attacks, those who actually survived the onslaught were to fly back out into the Pacific and back to safety. For the most part, the attackers were aware that they would end up in either of those two categories. Either they would perish at Pearl Harbor, or, if they were lucky, they would remain in the air, managing to escape back to Japanese territory. However, one Japanese pilot, Shigenori Nishikaichi, would find himself in an entirely separate predicament. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, at 7:55 a.m., Nishikaichi, along with 353 other aircraft, launched from 6 Japanese aircraft carriers before bombing the naval base, damaging and sinking 8 American ships, including the USS Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. Numerous American planes were also destroyed, along with other cruisers and destroyers. Worst of all, of course, were the 2,403 US military personnel that were killed. Only around 2 hours after this, by 10 o'clock, the attack had essentially reached its conclusion, and those Japanese pilots who survived turned around and fled Hawaii. That is, all except for Nishikaichi. His aircraft, an A6M20, had been badly damaged during the assault, and, as he would come to find out, wouldn't be able to escape from the Hawaiian Islands. He would manage to fly approximately 145 miles west from Pearl Harbor, but would fail to keep himself airborne around the time he began to approach Niihau, the westernmost of the Hawaiian Islands. During the planning of the attack, the Japanese had actually believed Niihau to be completely uninhabited, and as a result, designated it as a location pilots were safe to land on should they be unable to return to Japanese territory. There, they could simply wait for rescue via submarine. This is exactly what Nishikaichi had in mind as he decided to slow his descent as much as possible before slamming down into a field on the island. Remarkably, he actually survived the crash, but to his surprise, he had company. As it turns out, the island was inhabited. Hawaiian native Hawila Kaleohano had actually seen the whole thing happen with his own eyes, and immediately ran over to investigate. Again, keep in mind that the attack on Pearl Harbor had only just occurred, so everybody living on this remote island in Hawaii had no idea that it had even taken place. Despite this fact, however, it was well known at the time that Japanese-American relations weren't too hot. The US was clear about its opposition to Japanese imperialism, and although they were still neutral in the war at the time, they had been supplying the Allies with military aid. With this in mind, Hawila approached the wrecked Japanese plane, and before he was even fully conscious, snatched the pilot's pistol and papers. From that point on, the Hawaiians were extremely kind to him. Plenty of others started to gather around him to make sure he was all right, completely unaware of the horrible attack he and his fellow pilots had just caused. However, living on the island was a Japanese-Hawaiian couple, consisting of Yoshio Harada, a Japanese immigrant, and Irene Harada, a Hawaiian native. Nishikaichi told the Haradas, who could speak both English and Japanese, of what had occurred, before demanding that his items be returned to him immediately. He had previously asked Hawila, the man who saw him crash before taking his gun and papers, to give them back, but he refused. The couple decided to keep their knowledge of Pearl Harbor, which they just learned from Nishikaichi, a secret, leading the rest of the Niihauans to throw him a luau, a type of Hawaiian party. After assessing the situation, the couple decided that they were going to work with Nishikaichi and help him to escape back to Japan. However, they really wouldn't have time to form a plan. Even though the island wasn't hooked up to electrical or telephone lines, through the use of a battery-operated radio, the locals suddenly became aware of the situation. They were informed of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and from there, it wasn't hard to put two and two together. The owner of the island, a man named Almer Robinson, at the time away on the nearby island of Kauai, was expected to return by the next morning. The islanders made the decision to send the pilot back there with Robinson, where he could be turned over to the proper authorities. Until then, however, they gave him permission to stay with the Japanese-Hawaiian couple, Yoshio and Irene Harada, under the supervision of 5 guards. However, the islanders weren't aware that the couple was actually planning on aiding Nishikaichi in his escape, which there was now plenty of time to formulate. Nishikaichi was desperate to get his things back from Hawila, more specifically his papers, which he feared contained Japanese military intelligence, such as attack plans and radio codes, that he didn't want to fall into the hands of the Americans. After some time had passed, only one of the guards had actually remained on duty watching the 3 inside. The 2 Japanese men, Nishikaichi and Yoshio, approached him claiming that they had to use the restroom. They approached a warehouse where the two men were swiftly able to arm themselves with guns and point them at the guard. They then threw him into the warehouse and locked him inside. After that, they began to run around the village, armed with their weapons, searching for Kawila, who still had the Japanese papers. The locals, obviously frightened, scattered across the island. Unfortunately for Nishikaichi, however, his documents were already long gone. Kawila had given them to one of his relatives, who set off by boat to reach the authorities and bring help to the island. In retaliation, the pilot burned down Kawila's hut and began threatening to kill everyone on the island if his papers weren't returned to him. This must have been a terribly frightening moment for these people because, again, for a very long time, it had just been them, all knowing each other, living on this tiny island. There was never anything to worry about until this Japanese pilot falls from the sky and wreaks havoc on their entire way of life. From there, a burly man named Ben Kanahile ran up to Nishikaichi and started attacking him. But again, he was still armed at this point and fired off 3 bullets, all of which were direct hits on Ben. This guy got shot point blank to the chest and twice in the hip, but he was still standing somehow, completely unfazed. Ben then grabs Nishikaichi, lifts him over his head, and throws him into a stone wall, knocking him unconscious. After that, Ben's wife runs up to the unconscious pilot and bashes his head in with a rock, drawing his rampage to an end. Ben survived his wounds despite having incurred them on such a remote island, and actually received the Purple Heart in 1945. Okay, I was planning on covering way more entries in this video, but they were just so dense and I didn't want to skim over all the details, so we didn't even get through the second layer. If you'd like to see me follow this up with a second part, be sure to leave a comment and let me know, as well as any other ideas for entries you might have.